From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. This is a terrific turnout. I'm Victoria Hill, Acting Chief of the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. On behalf of the staff of HSS and the Library of Congress, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's talk by Ed Miller. This lecture is part of an ongoing series of programs in the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. Ed Miller has been active in many different ways in the Library of Congress, and today we're pleased to have Ed as our scholar and author. I have several people to thank, including Rod Katz and Abby Yokelson, main reading room specialists, and a special thank to the sales shop, who is offering books for sale in the foyer as you walk in, and Ed will be signing books after the event. Also, a special thanks to the ITS folks for webcasting this afternoon's talk. You should know that it is webcast, and if you ask questions during the question and answer, you are giving permission for your voice to be heard and your face to be shown. And now to introduce the speaker today is Deanna Markham, Associate Librarian for the Library Services.
Thank you, Tori, and welcome everyone. You know, we have many book programs here at the Library of Congress, but rarely do I have the pleasure of introducing an author who has so many connections, deep connections to this institution, and more importantly, to the work that we all do. Edward S. Miller, or Ed as we so affectionately call him, first arrived at the library in the 1970s to begin research on his first book, War Plan Orange, the U.S. Strategy to Defeat Japan, 1897 to 1945. Based on research in formerly secret archives and through a wide variety of collections here at the Library of Congress, the book reveals the Navy's strategy to defeat Japan 4 decades prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Published by the Naval Institute Press in 1991, War Plan Orange won 5 Distinguished History Book Awards. Not bad for someone who keeps claiming he's not really an historian. Ed's educational studies at Syracuse and Harvard in economics. Hello, we do have some more seats up here, by the way. I'll interrupt my introduction just to encourage you to come up and take a seat. During Ed's professional career, he served as Chief Financial Officer of Amex Incorporated, one of the nation's largest metal and mining companies, as well as at the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporation. Following his retirement, Ed and his wife Joyce, who is with us today also, and we welcome her, moved to Washington, D.C., in part so that Ed could continue his lifelong interest in historical research. This knowledge of history and his thorough knowledge of finances and economics led to the writing of the book we're here to talk about today, Bankrupting the Enemy, the U.S. Financial Siege of Japan Before Pearl Harbor. Ed is able to interpret the complex financial strategies intended to bankrupt Japan prior to World War II, while also, and this is one of the things I most appreciated about the book, while I'm learning about these economic strategies, I'm also learning a lot about women's fashion during that period in American history. And it's the changes that took place in women's fashion and the impact of those changes on trade between the two countries. It's really a very fascinating story. Ed calculates that he has used at least 11 of our reading rooms researching these 2 books, including vast general collections in history, economics, and military science, as well as the special format divisions. Ed even uses microfilm. It's so wonderful. he's the kind of reader we love to have come to the library because he understands that the information is important and he'll go after it, whatever format it happens to be in. But he's used the general collections and most of our special format collections, and of course the Asian division materials as well. And I'm very happy to see so many of the librarians and curators from those divisions here today, because I know through this process they became deeply involved in Ed's research and are very happy always when someone they've been able to help produces a book and they can take special pride in that. So it's a kind of reunion for all of us, and we're very pleased about that. Finally, I want to tell you that Ed is not just a user of the Library of Congress collections. Ed is really part of our staff family. Ed decided to share his experience as a researcher by assisting other researchers who come to the Library of Congress to do their work. And he is a research guidance volunteer with the Visitor Services Office. And he serves at the desks in the Reader Registration Office, and he's out at the information desk in the Jefferson Building. And I know that it is the lucky library user who comes to this institution on the day that Ed is at the reader registration desk. Because when they go in and talk about what they think they would like to do, he very quickly sends them to the right place, gets them oriented, and they're ready to go. Ed and Joyce are also generous donors to the Library of Congress through their membership in the James Madison Council, the library's private sector advisory board. And they have established the Edward S. and Joyce I. Miller American History Trust Fund, which is intended to enrich the library's general collections. For all of these things, for Ed as a human being, for Ed as a researcher, for Ed as a library helper, and for Ed and Joyce's generosity, we are deeply grateful. And I'm so happy that all of you are here today to have an opportunity to learn more about the research Ed's been doing. Please join me in welcoming Ed Miller.
Well, thank you, Deanna. I'm really overwhelmed. You missed one thing. Deanna said I came here to Washington, moved to Washington to do research. That is half true. The other reason is I came to be near my money. Somebody on the way in today asked me, what is your book about? And I said, it's about $30. So let me begin with a bit of history. I'm usually here on Thursdays instructing new researchers where to find things, but today I'm in my own subject because some years ago I did write this book called War Plan Orange, which was about American war planning to defeat Japan, which began long before the war, and its broad concept was an offensive war ending in violent economic warfare, that is by blockade and bombing to win, and that's how the war in fact was won. And this drew my interest to another kind of war that the United States waged against Japan before Pearl Harbor. It was nonviolent but still deadly, and it was waged by deploying the power of the dollar. Only recently have the international records of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, been opened up to researchers under the Holocaust-era Records Act, so now the full story can be told. So let's begin in 1937. President Franklin Roosevelt was exasperated by the dictators in Europe, and especially by the Japanese attack on China, and he famously declared that the democracies ought to quarantine the aggressors. Now, he didn't mean military action or sea blockades. He wanted a modern method, he said. After Japanese bombers sank a U.S. gunboat, he turned to his energetic Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., for ideas, and Morgenthau turned to his staff lawyer, Herman Oliphant, who represents a kind of person you'll be hearing about in the book, a mid-level bureaucrat, brilliant men, graduates of top universities, and very keen to enhance the role of their agencies in tough foreign policy. Oliphant recommended invoking the financial powers of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. That's where my title comes from, Bankrupting the Enemy, Trading with the Enemy. If you go on Amazon, you'll find all kinds of books like Sharing with the Enemy, Sleeping with the Enemy. There are all kinds. It's a very popular topic. So, Trading with the Enemy Act, and FDR said, my God, I'd forgotten all about it. Now, at this time, the country was leaning towards isolation. Congress was passing laws to keep the United States out of foreign wars, but with bizarre side effects. The Johnson Act of 1934. It punished countries that had defaulted on its First World War loans, and it became a crime to lend money to England or to France, but not to Germany or Japan. In 1935, a Neutrality Act barred the sale of munitions to all countries fighting a war. But Roosevelt refused to label the fighting in Asia a war because that would have deprived China of weapons which it needed, whereas Japan was self-sufficient. In 1937, an amendment ruled that even ordinary commodities could not be sold to belligerents at war, except on a cash and carry basis, that is, pay dollars immediately and carry it away in foreign ships. Roosevelt did not play his trump card, namely the awesome financial powers available to him that rested on two words in the Trading with the Enemy Act. And here's the background. During the First World War, the Wilson administration pushed for a law to forbid trade with enemies, either directly or through neutrals, a sensible thing, but a bureaucratic dogfight erupted in Washington. The Secretary of Commerce wanted to control exports directly. The Treasury Secretary, William Gibbs McAdoo, who happened to be Wilson's son-in-law, he wanted to freeze and control German assets. They compromised so that there would be both a commerce export license and a Treasury license to pay dollars from blocked enemy accounts. On the last few days as it was going through the Senate, a slick lawyer from the Fed named Milton C. Elliott, who was an early model of my technically savvy and hawkish bureaucrat, he slipped in the so-called paragraph 5B, and it passed. That article said that a president could invoke controls on foreign transactions and freeze foreign assets of an enemy country, or otherwise. Okay, so in 1923, the peace treaties eliminated all our enemies. The United States has no more enemies. The act lapses for all practical purposes, except those two words of paragraph 5B. In fact, Roosevelt forgot that he had invoked those powers in his first term, at first to declare a bank holiday, and later to raise the price of gold. And I might mention that act is still on the books. In the 1970s, it was renamed the War Powers Act, and today there are still 400 active executive orders which rest on those two words in the paragraph in Trading with the Enemy Act. Well, Roosevelt backed off from financial sanctions against Japan, and for the next 3 years after 1937, the idea was forgotten once again. And there were 4 reasons for this, which I'll describe and then tell you about in detail. First, Japan's dollar earnings were shrinking. This was both due to problems in marketing their goods and to U.S. exclusionary policies like tariffs. Secondly, U.S. government analysts were keeping a watch on Japan's finances and believed that it would soon deplete its reserves and have to halt the war in China. Third, America embargoed some commodities directly, initially those in short supply and needed for its defense, but eventually even products that were abundant. And those export controls were cumbersome and not all that effective. Finally, the dollar became the dominant world currency, surpassing the British pound sterling. Because after September 1939, it was the only currency freely convertible by any and all holders. And the U.S. Treasury was the sole buyer of gold in the world. And with the rest of the world at war, strategic materials were only available from the United States and to a small extent from other Western Hemisphere countries that also sold only for dollars. Now I'm going to go through these. Turning to reason number 1, Japan exported only one major article that Americans wanted, namely raw silk, which was the thread made by unwinding silkworm cocoons. It's remarkable that in the 1920s, a thread spun by insects, think about that, by insects, was this country's largest import. Nearly all of it came from Japan, and nearly all was used for elegant women's clothing, which Diana mentioned. 2 million Japanese families depended on this silk industry. Along the way, American silk manufacturers had to overcome many obstacles. For example, back in the bustle and petticoat era, a fancy outfit that a woman wore was cut from 10 square yards of fabric. By the way, my wife Joyce was wondering about my research into women's underwear, but I assured her it was legitimate. Then by the 1920s, the skimpy outfits of the flappers, they were wearing outfits cut from only 2 square yards. However, a garment industry sprang up to sell more dresses, which counterbalanced that. Silk fabrics had defects that were due to the unevenness of the yarn, but there was good quality control in America and new innovations like crepe fabrics, textured fabrics that covered up the defects. Silk held its own, even against rayon, which sold for $1.50 a pound versus $6 for silk, and things went along pretty well in the 20s, but then came the Great Depression. The silk cloth industry literally evaporated. It was a luxury product. U.S. production dropped from 47 million square yards in 1929 to only 6 million in 1939, and the price of raw silk in Japan crashed by 75%. However, the silk trade with Japan survived for a final decade because of a new vogue for silk stockings to go along with short skirts, which was another legitimate investigation, American women, inspired by Hollywood, demanded sheer hosiery that cost the equivalent, get this, of $20 in today's money. I'm told good pantyhose today costs around $5. So silk hung on as Japan's primary dollar earner until Nylon Day, May the 15th, 1939, when DuPont introduced nylon stockings at the New York World's Fair. They were beautiful and flawless and more durable. By 1941, they had captured 30% of the hosiery market. With new factories, they were on track to take 100% of the market in 1943. So nylon substitution was about to bleed Japan of $100 million per year of dollar earnings, which was twice its annual oil imports from the United States. By the way, these numbers sound trivial to today, but you have to remember that in dollar terms, the United States economy is now 150 times larger, and the Japanese economy is 500 times larger in dollar terms than back then. I suggest mentally multiplying by 1,000, that is, when I say million, think billion. Well, Japan tried desperately to sell other products to earn dollars. It had an enormous cotton textile industry, which was in fact the #1 world exporter, but it didn't gain even 1% of the U.S. market, and even that was soon blocked by so-called voluntary quotas. Anyway, cotton was a losing game for Japan. It needed American long staple cotton for strength and to blend with cheaper Indian cotton, so it actually spent more dollars than it took in. Japan also tried exporting specialty farm products like green tea, camphor, menthol for cool cigarettes, and small tablewares and consumer goods that were made in workshops and even in households. But these manufacturers were eviscerated by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which levied vicious duties on Japanese trifles. Only Japan was pummeled by so-called compound duties, such as 50% of value and 2 cents per piece on cheap plastic sets of dolls for girls and toy soldiers for boys, which weren't even produced in America. The combined tariff was over 100%. Among the 20,000 tariff rates set by Congress, which I examined, I found some on Japanese articles as high as 200, 400%, even 800%, the highest in U.S. history. The only non-Japanese exception I found was men's opera hats from France. Even the rich suffered. Japan had one contrary small success in selling luxury ocean products, crab meat and albacore tuna and fish liver oils, but all of these other exports to America amounted to only half the value of silk. So that's the trade background. The second circumstance preceding dollar warfare was that American experts were continually evaluating Japan's monetary problem. They had privileged information, inside information, for two reasons. First, the Central Bank of Japan held most of its reserves in gold, and it began shipping gold bars to the West Coast every week for sale to the Treasury in order to settle Japan's big trade deficits due to the war. And the second privileged information they had was the fact that the proceeds of those gold sales, in fact, all of Japan's dollar transactions cleared through American banks, which had to report the transactions to the Treasury and to the Fed. From 1937 through early 41, the analysts of those two financial agencies and of the State Department and the embassy in Tokyo and even Army and Navy intelligence kept a suspicious watch. And they concluded that Japan would go bust in the next 6 to 24 months. In other words, in 1938, the analysts said doomsday would be in 1939, and in 1939, the analysts said in 1940, and so on. The date always slipped further ahead. There was a lot of confusion as to why this happened because Japan had stopped publishing statistics after 1937, and the Americans had to guess wildly at whether the subsidies for gold mining were effective or how much smashed gold, which was jewelry and plate that the patriotic Japanese surrendered for yen to the government. And it took them time to realize that Japan could not mobilize dollars by selling off its foreign investments or remarket old dollar bonds that Japanese investors had repurchased. The fact of the matter is that the American experts were duped by a scam, by a Japanese scam. Japan was building a war chest right under their noses in Lower Manhattan. It began when they yanked their gold deposits out of London in 1938, and it continued with the proceeds of these excess gold sales to the Treasury. And they hid those dollars at 120 Broadway in an account at the New York agency of the Yokohama Specie Bank. This was Japan's largest overseas bank, nominally private, but actually government-controlled. Technically, the money was parked surreptitiously in what was called a custody account, which was fraudulent accounting. I explain how in this book. On August the 3rd, 1940, an alert officer of the New York Fed spotted a strange transaction, which led to investigations and which led to Japanese bank officials confessing under threat of criminal penalties. By the end of 1940, Washington understood that Japan had hidden up to $160 million as a war chest. This was equivalent to 3 years of oil purchases, for example. By January 1941, Japan knew the game was up. It stopped shipping gold, and it raced to spend those dollars or to get them out of the United States before the freeze. Okay, the third situation, meanwhile, what was going on was experiments by the United States with direct restriction of exports. Roosevelt had no legal authority to interfere with foreign trade except munitions unless he invoked the financial powers of the Trading with the Enemy Act. But he didn't. In 1938 and 39, he resorted to moral embargoes, so-called, by asking industry voluntarily to deny Japan products needed for aerial bombing, planes, aviation gasoline, light metals, plant designs, and machinery. A bigger step came in July 1940, after the fall of France, when Congress, in a rush, empowered Roosevelt to restrict exports of any commodities needed for defense that were in short supply. Now, knowing about there would be inevitable scramble for power in Washington, Roosevelt finessed the bureaucracy by appointing a military man, General Russell R. Maxwell, as administrator of export control to report directly to the White House. Roosevelt himself identified many essential commodities and limited the sales to Latin America and to the British. At first, these actions didn't bother Japan until October 1940, when scrap iron and steel exports were halted. Japan made steel by two processes. One is called the basic open hearth process, and the other the electric furnace process, which required respectively 50% scrap and 100% scrap in the furnaces. As a recent industrializer, Japan was short of scrap, whereas the U.S. had torn up railroads and junked machinery during the Depression, which was uneconomic to ship to the mills in Pittsburgh from places like California and Texas. So scrap was cheap and abundant, and Japan had stockpiled several years worth. In early 1941, America added to the embargo sales of other metals, most chemicals, machine tools, and even a few innocent products like certain foods and pharmaceuticals. Cordell Hull, the free trade-oriented Secretary of State, objected, but his only victory was to assure that oil would continue to flow to Japan, non-aviation grades of oil, and he was supported in this by the Navy, which felt unready for war. The fourth and final precondition of financial warfare was the sudden dominance of the dollar. In the gold standard years and through the 1930s, most currencies were convertible to each other through the foreign exchange markets, and at rates that didn't fluctuate nearly as much as nowadays. So Japan continually acquired dollars by swapping the hard currency it earned by exporting to the Pacific dominions and colonies of the British, the Dutch, and the French empires, and from silver that it earned from the China trade. The yen itself, however, wasn't convertible except in the yen bloc, which meant the Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and North China. But the Japanese Empire had almost no war commodities that Japan needed. The situation changed abruptly in September 1939 when Britain and the rest of Europe laid on exchange controls, at first rather laxly, but intensely after mid-1940, which John Maynard Keynes complained about, that they let a lot of dollars escape during the phony war period. After that time, Japan, for example, when it sold textiles to India and was paid in sterling-type currencies, could only spend those proceeds within the fortified sterling area, which had nothing to sell that Japan needed, such as oil. It couldn't convert those earnings to dollars to buy in the Americas, which did have what it needed. Okay, that was the long wind-up, and now the pitch. We arrive at the beginning of 1941, when attitudes in Washington underwent a tectonic shift. Harry Dexter White, who was Morgenthau's resident genius and another power grabber, urged him to freeze Japan's dollar assets before the secret stash got away. But more importantly, FDR appointed a new Assistant Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. Acheson was a lawyer who wore a sporty mustache, and he was a former Undersecretary of the Treasury and vigorously anti-Axis. He is my supreme example of that kind of mid-level bureaucrat seizing the reins of policy to gallop ahead with financial warfare. By the way, Deanna, in the movie, Acheson will be played by Geraldo Rivera. Finding himself in charge of the State Department's tiny regulatory division under the Neutrality Acts, he made a power grab to take over General Maxwell's Export Control Agency. But Hull slapped him down. Nursing his wounds, he got tutored by hardliners in the Treasury and the Justice Departments, and by visiting British managers of economic warfare, which the British called the fourth arm of the military service. Acheson pushed to freeze Japanese assets through invoking the Trading with the Enemy Act, and in March 1941 he even got regulations drafted. But again, nothing happened. The Treasury, the customary administrator, was distracted by funding Lend-Lease. Now, you know, Washington abhors a vacuum. And into the breach marched the chief of General Maxwell's Projects Division to investigate Japanese dependence on raw materials of the United States and the Allies. He recruited 60 experts from the various Washington agencies, like the Bureau of Mines and the Forestry Agency and the Commerce Department. In April 1941, these various study teams wrote 37 documents entitled The Economic Vulnerability of Japan in, and then you insert oil or copper or iron. Almost all of these studies advocated halting trade. Some of them cleverly suggested indirect ways to hurt Japan. For example, America did not export aluminum or bauxite ore for aluminum smelting, but it could deny two small but vital ingredients, fluorspar and petroleum coke, to halt their aluminum production. The most intriguing study was one on phosphate and potash fertilizers, because Japan was the world's most intensive user of fertilizers. They predicted that harvests of wheat and other grains, except rice, which depends on nitrogen, that these harvests would collapse after 2 years of embargo. And this proved right on the mark during the war. By mid-war, the grains were slumping badly. Now, these vulnerability reports, although fragmented, were the only serious investigations of the impact of a halt of trade on at least some parts of the Japanese economy. After that, the export controllers lobbied to freeze Japanese assets, for which they had absolutely no legal authority, just more bureaucratic hubris here, but the rush of events bypassed them. Matters came to a head rapidly. In June 1941, Roosevelt froze German and Italian assets, just as he had previously frozen the assets of conquered countries to protect them from the Nazis. U.S. intelligence reported that Japan would occupy southern French Indochina and threaten Singapore, and when it did, Roosevelt finally invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act on July 26, 1941, and froze Japan's assets. And the British and Dutch immediately did the same. Now, Roosevelt intended a cooling off period of a couple of months, followed by a limited resumption of trade, most notably exports of oil at a 50% of the 1935-36 level of exports. In the words of historian Jonathan Utley, he intended to bring Japan to its senses and not to its knees. But having been wearied by other bureaucratic squabbles, he assigned the Freeze administration not to the Treasury, as was customary, but to a committee of 3 assistant secretaries: Dean Acheson of State, Edward Foley of the Treasury, and Francis Shea of Justice. Now, the latter two, also lawyers, were younger and relative lightweights, so it was Acheson who effectively controlled and made policy. And his policy was not another drop of oil for Japan. And indeed, the committee refused to unfreeze any dollars for any kind of trade. Let me talk about oil a little bit. Japan desperately needed gasoline and crude oil, not only for its military, but also for civilian uses, for transportation and its fishing boats. It was already rationing buses to 2.5 gallons per week and 1 quart for private cars. Japan imported 90% of its oil needs, of which 10% from the Dutch East Indies and 80% from the United States. There's a weird backstory to oil, which goes like this. In 1941, Japan was buying only from California because of closure of the Panama Canal to its ships and because of a possible shortage of oil on the East Coast. Now, California produced 15% of U.S. crude, and it refined every grade of product, and it was awash in surplus oil. The wells and refineries were cutting back. Meanwhile, in May 1941, the United States loaned to Britain 1/5 of its Atlantic tanker fleet that brought the oil from Texas up to New York in order to deliver Lend-Lease oil to England. The Petroleum Administrator, Harold Ickes, argued that this would cause a shortage of gasoline in the Northeast, and he demanded rationing. Well, could California help out with all that surplus oil? No, it could not. There were no tankers available. There was no pipelines at that time east of Bakersfield, California. Railroad tank cars were scarce and outrageously expensive. And yet, when FDR announced the freeze, he blamed Japanese buying in California as a cause of the supposed shortage in New York. He lied, knowingly. What actually happened was that oil companies improvised enough transportation by devices like deep loading and diverting tanker voyages and using barges, and in the fall of 1941, a Senate committee debunked the shortage that never happened, and it excoriated Ickes. In any case, it turned out the British didn't even need the tankers, and they returned them all by November. Okay, back to the story. After the freeze of July 26, Japanese diplomats and bankers lobbied anxiously to unfreeze dollars, especially for oil. There were 2 empty tankers stranded in California, and they especially wanted dollar licenses to pay for a mere $178,000 of oil for those ships, for which Japan actually held valid export licenses. Well, Acheson, who was now the kingpin, accused them of hiding dollars in Brazil and whisking currency out of New York bank accounts, which was true in a small way, the Japanese offered to bring dollar bills from the Shanghai free market. Denied. Or to deliver gold. Denied. They offered to bring silk on a ship that was repatriating Americans. Denied. Well, by September 1941, the Japanese realized that the dollar freeze was airtight. And they then threw a Hail Mary pass. They offered to barter on a gigantic scale. But in a moment of political naivete, they hired as their agent an attorney named Raoul Desvernin. He was a right-wing zealot, a critic of the New Deal, who had earlier tried to finance steel to Japanese firms in Manchuria. Desvernin and his Japanese associates, including Mitsui and Company, proposed to swap commodities without using dollars. Here's what they did. They offered to swap high-grade silk suitable for parachutes. The U.S. estimated it needed about 200,000 military parachutes, in exchange for American goods, of which 2/3 was to be oil and gasoline, and the rest a kind of a hodgepodge, including cotton and paper tapes for IBM machines and even hops for beer. That proposal, with some follow-on swaps, amounted to $60 million in each direction. That is a two-way deal of $120 million, including enough oil for about a year. The scheme got as high as Vice President Henry Wallace, who Desvernin had particularly attacked as a communist, fascist, socialist. But he was the czar of economic mobilization. And what did Wallace do? Well, he referred it, of course, to Dean Acheson. Guess what happened? Denied, on the rather dubious grounds that it would violate the law which Acheson himself had created. All of this happened just as the Japanese cabinet was moving toward a decision for war. By the way, Deanna, Desvernin almost later went to jail, but that's another story. Okay, the narrative now degenerates into bickering over trivialities. What about a cargo that cleared Seattle 1 hour before the freeze went into effect? What about mink furs from friendly Southeast Asia that were already paid for by importers here, but were stranded in Kobe awaiting canceled ships? The foreign ministries of two great powers sank to squabbling over family remittances of immigrants, magazine subscriptions, and $11 worth of ceramic squirrels. The final squeeze on frozen dollars that Japan failed to extract from its bank accounts, which were then down to $30 million, came in November 1941. The Yokohama Specie Bank in New York was going broke. It owed interest on Japanese bonds owned by Americans, and it needed funds to pay diplomatic salaries and such, but it could not recover $19 million that it had advanced for raw silk that arrived here in warehouses before the freeze, because the U.S. government had impounded the silk, and it was leisurely testing the quality despite 2 previous inspections. So bankruptcy of the Specie Bank loomed no later than the end of 1941. This was the last straw. The Japanese diplomats realized they would not unlock any dollars to spend, not ever. Meanwhile, the negotiations between Ambassador Nomura and Cordell Hull dragged on. America's demands for its 4 principles mainly involved rolling back Japanese conquests in Asia, and Japan's major demand was to loosen the freeze and resume some trade. And as you know, Japan was meanwhile plotting the attack. On November 22nd, as aircraft carriers were gathering for the voyage to Pearl Harbor, Dean Acheson wrote a self-congratulatory tribute to the efficacy of the freeze, how wonderful it was working. Had he unbent his rules just a little bit, perhaps the war might have been deferred, but we'll never know. Now, that was a counterfactual question, a what-if question. But I end the book with a grander speculation, namely, how badly would Japan's economy and people have suffered if it had not attacked, but hunkered down and endured the dollar freeze for, say, another 2 years? Surprisingly, there was no such American study. The vulnerability studies of April 1941 did not address the entire economy, nor did the Japanese cabinet agencies make any such study that I can identify. The authorities in both countries offered only limited observations. Both sides predicted when the stockpiles of a few materials would run out and when certain industries would probably shut down, generally seen as a matter of months. And both sides mused that Japan faced impoverishment or pauperization or disintegration or other platitudes for bankruptcy, but without any comprehensive or scientific study. Well, I wanted to conclude my book with an evaluation of potential Japanese suffering. But I didn't want to invent one out of whole cloth, not even silk cloth. So one day in the bowels of the Library of Congress, just down the hall, I discovered an unpublished study, 500 pages long, which was written during the war, 1943 to 1945, by a joint team from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and the State Department. The title is The Place of Foreign Trade in the Japanese Economy. The principal author was Arthur B. Hershey, a young Federal Reserve economist who was born in China but educated at Yale and Columbia. It attempted to predict Japan's economic fate 5 years after losing the war. But, and this is important, it was based entirely on data from the early and mid-1930s, which was the only factual information available here at that time. So I saw a fit. As I plowed through it, I realized that there was a similarity between two hypothetical eras. One, Hershey's look at a Japan impoverished after a few years of post-war reconstruction, or two, a Japan at peace but impoverished in the early 1940s by the dollar freeze. Well, with the audacity that only a degree in economics provides, I converted Hershey's figures to dollars. I calibrated for differences such as the neutering of gold during the freeze versus loss of the empire after the war. I calculated per capita figures because Japan's population would grow from 70 million to 80 million in that 10-year period, despite war losses and many other adjustments. Now, Hershey had emphasized the dismal terms of trade. During the 1930s, prices of Japanese exports, like silk, were falling, while prices of the industrial commodities and machinery that it needed were rising, so Japan had to work harder to stay even. And like many economists, he projected a return of the Depression after the war, similar circumstances, so he expected a dire situation. He couldn't reliably guess at Japan's exports, especially silk versus nylon, so he calculated how much the country would have to import to survive, and then he reverse engineered into the exports necessary to finance it. He premised a case A and a case B on two levels of nutrition. Case A assumed a food intake of 2,250 calories per person per day, which was about the same as in the 1930s, and of this 5/6 from starches, mainly rice, and only 3% from protein from 3 ounces of fish. In comparison, Americans at that time ate 3,150 calories. However, the average Japanese male was 5'3.5" tall before the war, and females 4'10.5", so in body mass they probably weren't undernourished. Nevertheless, under the freeze, Japan would have to divert most of its meager income to food and fertilizer and basic materials for food and clothing and housing, leaving little for export industries and infrastructure. Japan's decade of spectacular economic growth in the 30s would be negated. But case B was far worse. Hershey assumed the standard of living would be rolled back to the 19th century. Exports would be feeble, just some farm specialties and handicrafts, amounting to 1/3 of pre-war exports. And so imports would suffer accordingly. Calories would drop to 1,800. Anyone who's dieted on 1,800 calories a day knows what that feels like. 10 million people would try to flee the crowded cities for the countryside, where conditions might be even worse. No Japanese would have been cheered up by Hershey's remark that the standard of living would not necessarily fall below that of China or India. Well, I concluded that the impact of the freeze lay somewhere between case A and case B. I pictured the Japanese people under the freeze nourished barely adequately without much protein or variety, wearing shabby rayon staple clothing that dissolved in the rain, and wearing wooden shoes, crowded by a housing shortage, electricity rationed, transportation crumbling. Life in Japan under a long-term freeze would have probably resembled life in the most miserable counties of America in the depths of the Depression, something like Tobacco Road, but with nowhere to escape and no hope for relief. We'll never know, because Japan chose to attack Pearl Harbor even before the stockpiles gave out. So that brings me to a final speculation. Was there any course open to Japan other than slow strangulation or war? During the Tokyo war crimes trials, high officials insisted that those were the only two choices. But in my imagination, Japan might have negotiated to withdraw from China gradually in return for some thawing of the freeze. It might have renounced the alliance with Germany, especially after Hitler began to lose. It might even have joined the Allies against Hitler. Now, don't laugh, because the model for this is 1914. Japan joined the Ally side, did a little bit of fighting, it scooped up colonies, and it prospered by selling ships and munitions to the Allies. Imagine a replay, a rich industrial Japan at the end of World War II, with the largest regional navy and army, just as the Far East was decolonizing. It would have attained economic security and trade riches that eluded it when the United States froze its dollars and Japan made the worst possible choice of attacking Pearl Harbor. Thank you.
Ed has said that he could take a few questions, and then afterwards he'll sign his book.
Thank you.
Rod?
How do you know that Atchison acted on his own to punish the Japanese? Isn't it possible that he was acting for Roosevelt to push them to the wall and possibly even provoke a war?
The question is, did Atchison act on his own, or was he really secretly doing Roosevelt's bidding? The standard historian's interpretation, there's almost no documentation. The standard interpretation is right after the freeze, where Roosevelt said, we'll do it for a couple of months and then try easing up. Roosevelt went off for 2 weeks to meet Churchill in Newfoundland, and when he came back, Atchison's iron-bound freeze was already in effect, and it was politically popular, and so Roosevelt said, well, let's let it go on that basis. And that's sort of become the standard interpretation. Roosevelt was cagey. He never wrote anything. It is possible that with nudges and winks, he prodded Atchison, who was one of his favorites. He brought him back into the administration early in '41, and that Atchison was being a good soldier and doing what was expected. In his memoirs, he doesn't mention a word about this. He just talks about this one Japanese ship left in California that, like the USS Maine and the War of Jenkins' Ear, was the cause of a great war. But it's certainly possible that something was going on, but I'm sticking with the standard interpretation that he did it on his own. Tom? Yeah.
Where did you find those 37 vulnerability reports? Are those in those new archives that are recently opened?
No, those vulnerability studies were part of were done under the Export Control Administration, which has been opened for years and years. There's about 2 miles of records of the wartime trade controls. I'm sorry, yes, in the National Archives. You may have copies here, I don't think so. They were widely distributed. They were distributed throughout, maybe 50 copies were distributed throughout the government, so they're not hard to find. They were part of Maxwell's men during that hiatus when the Treasury was looking the other way, tried to put together a total report for how to conduct economic war against France, of which this was the biggest part, but that report has disappeared. I cannot find it anywhere. I know that General Marshall got it, Admiral Stark got it. I wish I could find it, but I couldn't, but I'm pretty sure that everything that's in there I've mentioned. Yes, sir.
During those periods when incremental limitations were put on Japan, was there any reduction of their aggressiveness?
Reduction of what?
Aggressiveness
Oh, okay. Did the run-up to the war, the embargoes, and eventually the freeze, I guess, did that stop Japan, slow down Japan? The answer is no, it did not. It was a failed policy, basically. Japan did slow down its war in China, but due to military reasons, once they had conquered most of North China and the ports, they did slow down. But then, as you know, they moved into Indochina and threatened East Asia, and so it did not slow them down. No, it was a failed policy. The United States has imposed dollar sanctions at least 75 times during the Cold War and a number of times since, and I'm not sure how effective they've been. It certainly wasn't effective the first time out. Yes, sir.
This may be a naive question here, but it seems to me that the people, Atchison and others who were implementing all of these controls must have been able to see that they would eventually lead to war. Did they want war with Japan? Did they anticipate that?
You know, that's a very good question. Did these heavy-handed controllers want war to provoke Japan? There's evidence on both sides. Certainly they were hawkish. They wanted to play the hard line. Slap these fellows down. We're not ready to go to war, but let's use the powers we have to deny them the ability to wage war. It backfired. The Japanese chose to go the other way. Did they actually want to provoke a war? They certainly didn't say so in writing. It was all about forcing them to back down, using coercive, non-war coercive methods. Perhaps some of them wanted war, but they're certainly not in the documents.
I just have a quick question as far as, did you find that the U.S. Coordinated its economic warfare policies with the Dutch, specifically Dutch East Indies and the British in the Far East? Because I know as far as like Anderson's book on the role of oil in U.S. foreign policy during the same period, there was a lot of coordination to essentially embargo Japan. You mentioned 10% of Japan's oil came from the Dutch East Indies, and that was also cut off at great risk to the Dutch East Indies. Was there any sort of higher level coordination, or was it really just on oil that we coordinated with the British and the Dutch?
Right. The question is, did America coordinate with the British and Dutch allies in these embargoes and freezes? The answer is yes. The British, the following day, Churchill said he would follow within the hour, and he did. Next day, the British froze Japanese assets, and the Dutch East Indies authorities. Holland was conquered, but there was a Dutch government in New York which looked after the Indies. They did coordinate at a high level. The Dutch were surprisingly resistant, seeing how exposed the Dutch East Indies were. The Japanese did send a delegation to negotiate oil from the Indies. The Japanese were getting very little from the Indies before. It was all going. It was going to Australia and India and the other, and a lot for ships. A lot the Dutch were servicing the ships in the Far East. They did negotiate with the Japanese. The Dutch had enough oil that something like 60% of their oil would be sufficient to supply Japan. They wouldn't have needed American oil, but they were surprisingly vigorous in resisting the Japanese. They only the Japanese only got 10% of the Dutch East Indies oil after November 1940, so they still totally needed the American oil. Also, the Dutch didn't make high-grade gasoline and other such products that Japan needed. They could get crude oil, but it's I kind of shortchanged the British and Dutch because I wanted to focus on the dollar as the key to the situation. Yes, sir.
I'm surprised. The Germans made oil from coal. They also had the secrets, basically how to put octane into the gasoline and run their tanks. Why is it that that technology was not shared with the Japanese, and they would have made synthetic oil rather than paper?
Question, why didn't the Japanese make synthetic oil like the Germans did? They did try. In Manchuria, there are huge low-grade deposits of oil shale, which is an oil-bearing rock, and they had huge plans to be 50% self-sufficient by the middle 1940s, and it was trifling. One of the odd problems is they were short of steel, to build these huge reactor vessels, in which you bake the oil out of the shale. Even the United States today doesn't produce shale oil, despite all our technology. The Germans made it from coal, which is a different matter, but they had slave labor and much better technology, adequate steel, all of Europe's resources at their feet. But it was still very small. The largest German plants produce 60,000 barrels a day. The United States consumes 18 million barrels a day. It wouldn't serve the United States for an hour. Yes, sir.
In the course of your research and writing that book, did your opinion change, or were more questions raised as far as how much of a surprise attack Pearl Harbor really was? Have has your thinking been affected by that?
Yeah, did I come to think that Pearl Harbor was more inevitable because of the severity of the controls? I haven't actually thought about that, but I think I'd have to say yes, because I realized there was not only an oil embargo, which 100 other historians have written about, but there was this dollar freeze, which was really much harsher than just embargoing particular commodities. After all, there was other oil in the world. South America produced oil, Mexico, Peru. But without dollars, Japan couldn't do anything. The other thing was, the reason I dwelt on silk and other things is Japan faced a long-term disaster. They weren't going to be able to earn any dollars if under peacetime conditions. And this was really driving it to the wall. They really were exhausting their gold and other reserves. So I guess I would say that it probably elevated the stature of the hawks like Yamamoto, who wanted to attack. It made it easier for him to sell his program. Jeff?
Yes, Ed. Question on, after 41, the Japanese still conducted war, which is, I assume, a big draw on resources for 4 years, and it looked like the war would continue well beyond 45 before the atomic bomb. How do you reconcile the analysis, okay, that they were drained as an economic area and they may have a bleak future when they can maintain a vigorous war effort for 4 years, if not longer, in that particular process as far as the resourcefulness of their economy and that kind of stuff? I'm just curious what your thoughts on how they were able to maintain that war effort for 4 or 5 years after this embargo and the shortages that they encountered during a vigorous war.
The question is, how could the Japanese fight a 4-year war when they were short of commodities? Well, it was very simple. They went down and conquered the Dutch East Indies within 2 months and simply took the oil there. As it turned out, that didn't work too well. By the way, the Dutch did blow up the refineries and sabotage them, but they didn't do a very good job. Within a few months, they were back online near fully. However, the problem was tankers. They had no anti-submarine protection, and bringing the oil to Japan for refining was soon halted by American submarine attacks. American submarines sank 60% of the Japanese merchant marine, and altogether 80% was sunk by American attacks. So, in fact, late in the war, they had to move the fleet to Singapore to be near the oil rather than base it in Japan, where they couldn't get any oil. So that's the answer. And the U.S. was well aware of this, that the Japanese might move into the Indies, which meant they'd have to conquer Singapore and the Philippines to protect them. There was a lot of, I have studies in here of the Japan stockpile condition. Our Navy overestimated how much Japan had in oil. They thought Japan had enough for 2 years of war in the stockpiles. The United States, by the way, was selling steel tanks, knockdown steel oraged oil tanks that were going to Japan. They got it wrong. The civilians and the export controllers figured Japan had only enough for 6 months, and they were much nearer to the mark. But the conquest of the Indies made it happen. As far as other products like steel and copper, they had stockpiles of scrap, but basically they simply cut off materials for the civilian sector, except the most vital things like railroad bridges and things like that. Yeah.
I want to cut off the question and answers, but I want to thank Ed Miller so much for his terrific talk, and if you would like to speak with him later, he'll be signing his book up at the front of the room.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.